Dear participants, we will now commence our program. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm greeting to every one of you. The honorable guest speaker for today's session, Professor Christian Ochia, the honorable head of Economic Study Program FEBUB, Mrs. Marlina Ekawati, PhD, will give the opening speech, and all the audience for today's session. Welcome to the third session of 3-in-1 program with the theme Rethinking Economic Development Policy Lesson from COVID-19. I'm Stephanie Sitorus, and it is my pleasure to welcome you and serve as your Master of Ceremony on today's agenda. If you missed the previous guest lecture, you can rewatch it on the Department of Economics FEBUB official YouTube channel. Before we start with our agenda, let's first listen to the opening speech from Mrs. Marlina Ekawati, PhD. To Mrs. Marlina, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Stephanie. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang, good afternoon. Very warm greeting to our distinguished guest lecturer, Professor Christian Samen Ochia from Nagoya University. Konnichiwa. And all the participants and also our students. As a head economic development study program, I am more than grateful to stand here and welcome you all to our 3-in-1 program of Economic Department Brawijaya University. This program is interpreted as a learning activity which is given by 3 teachers elements. Include UB's native lecturers, international visiting professor, and professional lecturers from private sector, stakeholder, or expert from related field. As a part of 3-in-1 program, our guest lecture today by Professor Ochia will not only guide us all, but also educate us regarding a variety of this pertaining to rethinking economic development policy lesson from COVID-19. We all are surely grateful for this prospect. All the vital aspects regarding the topic will be conveyed to you all. I wish the guest lecture enlighten us all and provides us with approaches to deal with the problem of tomorrow. Thank you to everyone who made this program possible with their opinion and views. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Marlina. Now, without further ado, let's start with our main event, a guest lecture from Professor Christian Ochia, which will be moderated by one of the lecturers of the Department of Economics, Mrs. Farah Wulandari, PhD. Please welcome Mrs. Farah Wulandari and Professor Christian Ochia.
Thank you, Mbak Stephanie. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon also for Professor Ochia and all of the participants here. My name is Farah Pangestuti and I am a lecturer in Economics Department, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Brawijaya, Indonesia. And it is an honor for me to be here as your moderator in today's discussion. And I am super excited to have Professor Ochia a second time because we have met before in our 3-in-1 discussion also in 2021, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, I'm very excited to have Professor Ochia today as our honorable guest lecturer. And before we begin, let me introduce you to our speaker again a second time, Professor Christian Ochia. He is an associate professor of economics at Nagoya University, Japan. He earned a bachelor degree from University of Kinshasa, France, in mathematical economics, and his master and PhD degree are from Nagoya University, Japan, in the field of international development. Professor Ochia's research interest lies in the areas of political economy, labor economics, behavioral and experimental economics, and economic development. And he is an expert, especially in CGE model, with so many awards, including from the International Input-Output Association and the Pan-Pacific Association in Input-Output Studies, and also many more. Yeah. And today we will learn from Professor Ochia about rethinking economic development policy lessons from COVID-19. And as we all know, our planet faces an unprecedented health, social, and economic crisis, one that puts every nation on earth in danger and challenges all fundamental assumptions about our world. The COVID-19 pandemic threatens to reverse decades of development progress. It has also exposed the vulnerability of developing countries and magnified the inequality that exists both within and between nations. We will have a maximum of 2-hour lecture, and 30 minutes Q&A sessions. So without further ado, I will give the screen and time to Professor Ochia to deliver his presentation. Please, Professor Ochia.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. This is my second time to lecture, and I like the first time. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do it again, because this has been a very good learning experience for myself, but also sharing the discussion, especially for today's topic. I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to sort of take you through most of the discussion in this area of especially how do we rethink economic development policy and what would be the lesson from COVID. This is, I think, a very interesting topic because we are still under COVID. There have been many policies put in place by governments so that we can control the situation. And we could see in many states that people start, going back to their natural life. Yesterday, I just came back from the Philippines and I could see people traveling around. The government of Japan, as of the day before yesterday, decided to open a tourism tour so people basically can come back to Japan for doing tourism. So I think there is a tremendous progress made toward recovery. Therefore, my topic today will try to situate where we're coming from, not only during COVID, but way before COVID in terms of economic development and what could be the new directions we can think of when we think about economic development. If it's possible, you can also interrupt me during my presentations. You can, if there is a need for clarification, you can always stop me and ask questions. Of course, we're going to have a Q&A after that, but you feel free to interrupt if you have any questions. So what I would like to talk today is basically the fact that sustainable income growth is the foundation for poverty and economic development. And usually when we think about development, I think income is one of our key concern or our key indicator, and looking how people's income growth, I think, is the foundation. Of course, there are many ways you can increase income of the population. One way is to give them more jobs. And what we found during COVID is that people could not go outside and work. Of course, in developed country, people could basically sit at home and work. But most of the employees in the world are workers in factories. But we found that many of them could not work. So one of the way COVID could have affected economic development and poverty reduction was because it affected income growth. So when we think about income, then of course, sustaining income growth is a recent phenomenon, because if you go back to the history, as this graph shows us, on the horizontal line, you have the years from year 1 up to 2001. And we can see that income starts to grow mainly in the 18th century. And you can see that income grew very fast for Western offshoot countries, but also for Western Europe. And we've seen like Africa is left behind, and also Asia, excluding Japan. So we see that there are many heterogeneity and a lot of disparity in income growth over time. This shows us that income growth is a result of continuous technological innovation as well as structural change. So continuing to innovate, creating new ways of promoting development, new technology is a key factor of economic growth. And countries are basically different by the way they initiate development, but also by the way they innovate and enhance structural transformation. So we can see that there are countries which are still lagging. And if you see the difference between income, let's say in Africa and in Eastern Europe, for example, you would see there are still huge differences. And probably there are many reports which points to the fact that most of those gaps in income will be diverged due to COVID. So we're gonna see that probably countries at the bottom of this graph would grow less, while countries at the top will also, of course, increase their income. Now, this is very interesting. If one wants to look at what would happen if we think about the structural change and also technological change. Now, if you go back to history, in the 16th century, we are here where income was almost similar across all the countries. What we see is that people were basically doing basic farming. This is really an individual type of cropping, and households were working near their families, together with the families, and they could enjoy community life after harvesting. So this is kind of a traditional way. And during this period, you can see income was basically growing very slowly, and the pattern was very similar around the world. Moving further in the 18th century, we could see a beginning of industrialization. And the beginning of industrialization, we could see here from the graph, some countries start picking up. You will see, for example, Europe starts to grow very fast because they embark in the industrialization process. And what we could see here, which is very interesting, is that many women start to work in companies, in factories. Basically, it was a very challenge because most of them were doing labor, kind of intensive work, but we could see there was kind of a division of labor, and factory were open for women, and income starts to grow very fast. But of course, men also had a lot of chance to increase their income thanks to the division of labor, but we could see huge income differences in the 19th centuries. And here you see countries invest a lot in naval forces, but we start having computers and also robots that could really affect how people live and how people think about economic development. And what is very, very interesting to see is that if you compare countries around the world, you will see many of them had differences in way they're urbanized, because we know that economic development goes along with urbanization. And there are many economic models. If you think about the Lewis model, for example, that basically inform us that when income or wages increases in urban area, worker will move from rural area to urban area to basically enjoy higher wages and boost agglomeration. So we could see that agglomeration economy became one of the key drivers of economic development. This tells us three different stories which we could remember about development and structural change. The first one is that industrial structure is endogenous to the endowment structure. So which means that each country should develop based on the availability of endowments that they have. So Indonesia has a tremendous population. of course, also natural resources. So one way to enhance development should be to develop industries that use both labor and also natural resources. So this is the main hypothesis, and that's what we could see around the world. For example, in Japan, Japan has small land. There is not enough land for everyone. So one way to boost agricultural development and was to develop high yield crops and industrialize the country, because that was the best way to promote development by increasing productivity. If you look at the United States, they have tremendous land, and agricultural development has been enhanced by mechanization. So basically, they're using big machine for harvesting. That is one of the drivers of economic development. So using the endogenous structure is one of the key elements for economic development. And of course, initial endowments can also affect the factor prices because of the comparative advantage and the optimal industrial structure. So basically, countries over time have to find what is their optimal industrial structure. What we could see in Japan, for example, is that most of the industries move to innovation and service sector. So service sector is one of the drivers of the economy, because it adapts to the dynamic comparative advantage of the country. So if you think about the dynamics, income growth will depend on how much you upgrade your endowment. So basically, as time goes, changing the structure of the economy is probably one way to enhance development. The other is, of course, upgrading the industrial structure. So we could see also that hard and soft infrastructures are, again, key for economic development and income growth. So the lesson here is that following comparative advantage is the best way to upgrade endowment structure and also to sustain industrial upgrading, income growth, and poverty reduction. So I'm going to take you through many of this discussion, because I believe that they're gonna reshape the way we rethink about industrial policy and economic development moving forward. Okay, so let me basically also argue that the way we think about economic crisis is not new, and crisis in economics is something that has been there for many years. And usually economists try to rethink economic development and development policy every time they face crisis. But everything starts with economic theory. So usually we economists believe that economic theory is the grounding power of any decision we make in life. So every kind of action that should be driven by economic theory. And economic theory really help us explain, observe economic phenomena. So for example, you can think about how economic theory could help us to explain what we see during COVID, during lockdown, for example. So when, the resources, because we believe that the mobility of resources is one of the key factors that promote reallocation of resources from low productive sector to high productive sector. So if you are in an economy where capital can move freely, when worker with skill can move freely, that can basically enhance economic development and structural change because of the matching between capital and skill also. But during COVID, we could understand that especially labor was not mobile. So people could not work, people could not change industry easily. So that's where economic theory is very important to inform us, what we could learn from those experiences. But at the same time, economic theory also guide economic policy and choices. And that's why you could see during COVID, many countries design what we call subsidy policy, because subsidy policy are a key factor to help short-term recovery. So during COVID, many firms could not access to capital, therefore they could not access to markets. One of the key policy was to subsidize them. And I think in many countries, like in Japan, many firms receive a lot of aid from the government so that they can keep at least their activity at minimum costs while, being under lockdown policy. So when we combine economic theory with data, we can draw development policy and we can make choices. But what happened is that if there is a failure of us to understand what are the driving factor of development or how to respond to crisis, what happened is that we have to rethink about economics. So what is happening now is that during COVID, most of the household could not, make their life in an easy way because the resources were not mobile. Many countries closed the border, and with lockdown, people could not go outside. And if your economy is not developed, for example, with the use of internet, then it was difficult for people to work from home. Therefore, my point today is that if there is a failure of the economic theory to explain, observe economic facts, also to guide economic policy, what we should do is to rethink economic development policy. And that's my argument for today. Now, as I mentioned before, if you think about the World Bank, they have been also in the process of rethinking economic development in many ways. First, they had this discussion of the East Asian miracle, basically arguing that export orientation and market-friendly development government have been the driver of the growth of the Asian tigers, for example. And of course, there is this economic report by the World Bank, which basically argued that there is no size fit all for policy. So if you want to design any policy, you should really focus on the country and also focus on the domestic phenomenon. And of course, there is the other growth report, which basically argued that openness, macroeconomic stability, high rate of saving and investment, market mechanism, committed, credible, and capable government are driver for economic development. So usually, economic development has been a continuous process of rethinking. And today, my point is that we should try to rethink about the way we see economic development policy. And I want to argue that we should really focus on SMEs, because SMEs are the key driver of employment and income, especially when economy are locked down. And I will tell you why. Before that, let me maybe go back to history and then situate you the way we think about economic development theory over time. So if you go back to the 1950s, 1960s, people usually focus on the market failures. And basically, in many countries like in Africa and Asia, in Latin America, most of the country put in place policy, which we call import substitution strategy. So basically, those countries were importing finished products from developed countries, and they were exporting natural resources. And the common idea was they should basically reduce the import of final product by producing those products by themselves. So basically, they want to develop industries to produce domestically imported product. And for that, they should give subsidies to companies which can do that domestically. But as we know, those policy failed, and most of them failed for the simple reason that they were not combined with export policy. So if you compare, let's say, Latin American countries with Asian countries, you will see that many Asian countries like Korea, like South Korea, also design import substitution strategy. But the difference stems from the fact that Korea combined the import substitution strategy with an export orientation policy. That's why economic development spurred faster in South Korea than in many Latin American countries or African countries. Moving forward, countries start to liberalize, and that was basically promoted by the Bretton Woods institutions, where in order to enhance government efficiency, we should basically privatize and marketize the markets. Of course, many countries were obliged by the World Bank to open their economy, and we could see there were a lot of mixed results. But what is very important here is that China, Vietnam, and Mauritius show us how double-track approach to transition can work efficiently. And one way was, of course, to combine, to liberalize partially. So for example, in the case of China, they developed what we call special economic zones and industrial park, where they started to open the economy step by step. So they tested some policy in the industrial zone and economic zone. If it worked, they brought it up to the entire economy. Vietnam followed the same pattern as China, while we see Mauritius also develop those industrial park to promote economic development through liberalization and integration to the global economy. And what is important here is that we learn from the successful countries like the East Asian tigers and China, Vietnam, and Mauritius, that market-based economy with a proactive role of the government is key to success. And that's how we learn how to promote economic development using liberalization, but more, I would say more interestingly, promoting development with a proactive government. Now, it is important that after that, we could still rethink about economic development, especially after the financial crisis. So as you know, we had the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and from there, countries start to rethinking economic development. So now, putting all of those discussions together, it's really important to remember that even where the countries were putting in place specific developments, the development paradigm also changed over time. What is very important here is that in the 1980s, in order to help developing countries to move from the failure of import substitutions, the World Bank especially decided to develop, or what we call to impose developing countries, especially those who were more in depth, the structural adjustment program. And that's led to the shrink of output in many countries. And of course, in the 1990s, the many institutions, especially, starts to promoting good governance. So basically having, a government that promotes, markets and then, clarity in the procurement process, for example, was the key for development. And in late 1999, many countries went through the reduction of poverty by developing the poverty reduction strategy papers. And now, of course, we're thinking about the new political economy of development. As you can see, those different paradigms were also followed up by different other, I could say enablers. So for example, now the development is being promoted under the SDG, for example. So this is one way for us to understand how we could promote development over time. But what is very important here is that over time, the way countries rethought about economic development have affected also their long-term development. So in the first development, in the first generation of development paradigm, agricultural modernization was one of the key factors, but the constraint was the lack of human capital. And of course, you can think also about the lack of market, private sector, and so on. And what is interesting to remember also is that moving forward, especially in the second generation, the export orientation industrialization was one of the key factors because it helped many countries like Japan to reach larger markets like the United States. So having those really special policy could be very, very important. But what was a key factor is that people, were still poor. And the reason was that the governments really intervened too much to the economy, putting market under competition. And, a lot of economists start to think about how do we promote basic needs. And that's why poverty became one of the key factor of economic development. One of the key policy is that we should try to reduce poverty as the goal of economic development, while many people were arguing that we should promote economic development. So you have the trade-off between whether you're going to promote economic development or whether you're going to reduce poverty. So that is very important because after in the 1990s, where we start talking about good governance, then the idea came that if we want to promote poverty reduction, then of course it's really important also to have good government, because with a weak government, it's really difficult to promote poverty. So government became, I think, one of the key driver of development paradigm. And it's really important also to think that when you go over time, you could also understand that the reason why people were poor, especially when we enter the 21st century, one of the reasons is that there are not enough incentives to get out of poverty in a fair and equitable way. So basically, it was discussed that poor have probably less incentive, and most of them are more likely to remain poor. So people start talking about the vicious circle of poverty. And this has been there for quite long now. This is a kind of a simplified overview, and I think our professor Otsubo who designed this paradigm. Basically, we are here now, and people have been arguing about the new political economy of development until 2020. And from 2020, moving forward, economists are still wondering what could be the key driver of economic development. How do we rethink economic development? And I think this is why today I'm very excited to be here, so that we can discuss, especially because we think that COVID has changed our ways of looking at development, especially because we have never seen people being locked down for at least 2 years in their home and starting to work from home for those who could do that. But what could be the driver of economic development? How could we rethink about the role of economic policy moving forward? I think this is one of the key factors I'd like to spend time discussing today. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next part of my my discussion today, trying to highlight a little bit what is economic growth. Basically, why are we interested in economic development? Before I move further, is there any question from this first part? Okay, I think Mohammed has a question.
Hello, good afternoon, Mr. Christian Ochia. I think we've already met before in our previous lecture. So, yeah, good to see you again, Mr.
Nice to
Christian
see you
Ochia.
too.
Yeah, I think I have a question for the economic development, also the economic growth. There is something in my mind that always that I ask about is the productivity, and also the factors of like the people who are already really lazy to go to do something, or to do something productive, for example. Is that the key factor of the what is it called? That economic growth slowing down? Is it? Yeah, I think we already know.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting question. So I agree with you, by the way, because as you know, productivity is the key driver of economic development, especially in the long term. We believe that productivity is the key driver of economic development. And if we try to see, basically, the productivity itself is a factor of many other indicators, such as human capital, but also physical capital and other determinants. And recently, there is a question, because the total factor productivity around the world has been slowing down. And one of the reasons is that human capital, especially the productivity from the human itself, is slowing down. And this is very intriguing, because if you look at the development of computers, for example, computer has been growing very fast in terms of capacity and also in terms of power, but more importantly, in terms of space. So now you have like, drive that are stored online with almost unlimited capacity, which means that in theory, we go back to the discussion of economic theory, that human productivity, labor productivity should increase very fast. But what is puzzling is that despite increase in, computer power and capacity, labor productivity is slowing down. And we don't really understand what are the drivers behind this low growth of labor productivity. So this is an open question. I hope some of you may be interested to do research on that, why we're trying to see some puzzling facts between the growth of computer capability and the slow growth of labor productivity, for example. So I think this is a very important question. And it reminds us also that, labor productivity probably went down faster during COVID because, as you know, many people did not have access to internet. In other countries, people don't have even a room, even in Japan. This is very interesting because in Japan, people feel comfortable working at work. So if you go in the factory in the morning, usually you are very productive because, you have all your equipment. But at home, usually people don't have habits to work, even in Japan. So what happened is that during COVID, many people were locked down and were obliged to do teleworking, basically working from home. But many of the Japanese people did not feel very comfortable working at home because probably the kids, because they don't have a good room as comfortable as in the office, or just because they're lazy, they become lazy staying at home. Therefore, there are many studies pointing to the fact that productivity went down in Japan somehow because many people did not feel really comfortable working from home, even if they have internet and they receive subsidies or even some allowance to work from home. So that is a very good question, which is applicable for developed countries like Japan, but also for many developing countries. So thank you very much for this very important question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christian Ochia. I think it's also that Japan, as I know, as I learned the culture also, like the culture of work, right? People do like they really like work in the office, and when they go home, they want to get some rest or something like that. So I think the productivity while in the COVID era, it's slowing down also because people do usually in their houses, like especially in Indonesia. And as a student myself too, I think I've become less productive in terms of studying, in terms of learning something, because there's limited space, and also I cannot do discussion with my friends. It's also like that. So I think it's also the key factor why, in my opinion, the key factor why productivity is slowing down in my perspective also.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the additions. That's a very good topic you raised. And I was, in the Philippines to do some field work. And what I found is basically that many, especially the children also, because for them, when they go to work, to study in the class, usually it's because they want to see their friends and play with their friends. So that is another motivation for them to go to study, because they can see their friends. But when they stay at home, as long as they don't play with their friends, they don't have any motivation to learn. And that was one of the arguments, that would explain why we see the education losses even among children. So I think the way people interact with their neighbors is very important, and that can explain highly the outcomes in terms of productivity, but also in terms of knowledge and in terms of what we can do. So I completely agree with your arguments, and I'm very happy to learn about the context of Indonesia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christian Ochia.
Okay, is there another question? Okay, then let me move further. Okay, so let me basically take you through some discussion, especially in the context, in the concept of economic growth and economic development, because I really want to probably have the same understanding of some of the key terms we're going to use here. So if you think about economic development field, the term of economic growth and economic development are usually distinctively used. And, economic growth is basically the growth in the size of the real economy in the country. And this basically measured by the growth of the GDP. So we call it, the economic growth rate. But when discussing its effect on poverty reduction, there are times where that increase in the average income per capita is considered economic growth. So basically the rate of per capita income is what interests us. So I'll be talking about economic growth later. So I want you to remember that I will be focusing also on the rate of the per capita income. And if you think about about economic development, the development itself is perceived as a process. Okay, so it's defined as a concept that involves the following structural change and social transformation that goes along with economic growth. So the first is industrial transformation, which is the shift from an agriculture-dominant society to a more industry-dominant society. And now we're talking also about the servicification of economy, where resources are also shifting from industry to services. And during COVID, people have been using a lot of services. Basically, people could order food and that is delivered at home instead of going to a restaurant. So we have those, delivery services, which became one of the key driver of economy and SME development. So we can think about industrial transformation, not only for industry, but also for services. And of course, economic structural change is one of the key factors, but that affects only institutions, not only the sector, but also institutions and also infrastructure. But we can also talk about the social transformation and the change in lifestyle that's accompanying urbanization. So now we're talking about labor migration from rural area to cities. But when we talk about the lifestyle, people probably are more likely to work from home now, which is a change in the lifestyle. That is also a social transformation. And the social transformation is very prominent during COVID. Of course, one of the advantages is probably people have more time to stay at home, talk with friends and family, which of course was not possible before COVID. But we can also see a cultural transformation. For example, if you think about the shift from a family or relative tribe-oriented organization to a more merit-based organization. And of course, we can also think about a political transformation, which include democratization, legal institution building for the establishment of property rights, contract enforcement, and so on. So these are most of the key terms I'll be discussing today. But what is very important here is that even if development is a process, we can also see development as an outcome, because it is considered that development has happened or has occurred already when human well-being has improved along with income growth. So we should really make a difference between the increase in income and the increase in well-being or welfare, because there are two different elements. Okay, and what I'll be really talking here is that if you think about Sear in 1969, he discussed the follows. The question to ask about what a country's development are, therefore, what has been happening to poverty? So basically, poverty was the key indicator for thinking about development. The other one is what has been happening to unemployment, what has been happening to inequality. So if you think about all these three has been declining from high levels, then beyond that, this has been a period of development that we should be much concerned. So that leads us to using this poverty growth triangle and economic growth. This is a new concept I would like to talk today. So when we think about development, we should think about the labor force, like unemployment. We can also go further, thinking about infrastructure, how they have progressed over time. But we can think about the business and community, schools, environments, and institutional capability. So for us, development is basically taking into account different dimensions of the society, which are very much interrelated. But when you talk about economic development and economic growth, one of the key factors is to observe the income convergence. And even COVID, we are trying to understand whether economic convergence has been happening in countries. And here we can see, for example, among all of the countries, China has been growing very fast. So if you compare the GDP of China between 2005 and 1965, we could see that China has grown very, very fast compared to other countries. Of course, East Asia and Pacific have been growing very fast. Among them, China has been a key driver of income convergence across the globe. But of course, that growth is very small if you compare between 2005 and 1985. So which means that, China has been slowing down, as well as many countries in East Asia and the Pacific. But if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, you can see that the country has been growing very, very slow compared to other countries, even like India or Middle East and North Africa. So sub-Saharan Africa has been lagging. And of course, there is no change between 2005 and 1965 or 1985. So we can see there are countries which are growing fast. And I will show you also that COVID could exacerbate those changes, those differences in income. But also, if we think about how the mean income of countries have been changing, and we could notice that, of course, mean income of most of the countries have been growing over time. But again, there are many disparities. So if we see the coefficient of variation, we see that the disparity remains among countries. And of course, there is not that much convergence globally, but we could see that there are some group of countries where we see some economic convergence. So basically, our way of thinking about COVID, especially post-COVID, is how do we accelerate global convergence of income? How do lagging countries can grow very fast after COVID? So this could be one of the goals of rethinking economic development policy after COVID. How do you help countries which have been slowing down to grow faster and accelerate their economic development? So there should be many factors. And we know, for example, that human capital is one of the key driver of faster economic growth and catch up. Government institutions are also key factor. So this could be one way to rethink about the way we see human capital. And the discussion with Mohammed was very interesting because we used to think about human capital, especially worker, as someone sitting in a factory and producing. But now we have to think about human capital as a factor that can work everywhere. So this is a way to accommodate, for example, when we design new houses, how do you create a house with everyone having a kind of a office in his house? This is the way we can think about urbanization. And in Japan now, if you go to a station, like a train station, you will see there is a small cabinet and it's written, you can work from here. So if you pay, like, for example, for 30 minutes or 1 hour, you can enter inside yourself, you plug in your computer and then start working and nobody will disturb you. You can even have a conference there using Zoom or anything. So we're trying to see small boxes everywhere in Japan where people can work remotely. So remote work has become one of the factors that could drive economic development. And we're trying to see people building new houses with a place where someone can work in a very comfortable way from home. So this is the way we should think about how do we invest in human capital, but also invest in infrastructures. And I have seen in Japan, there is a fast train which we call Shinkansen. I think you guys are familiar with Shinkansen. And there is a new design of Shinkansen whereby inside the Shinkansen, you have also a room where someone can do online conferences. So they create an equipment. Instead of having conferences in your seat, disturbing your neighbors, you can go there, sit down, lock the door, and launch your computer and do business meeting while you are on the Shinkansen. So this is how we are trying to modify human capital, but also institutions and infrastructure to catch up, especially with COVID. And I think this is the way we should be thinking about economic development. So globally, where you think about economic development, we know that growth is one of the key drivers of poverty reduction, but at the same time, inequality is also one driver of economic development. And what we could see from the table that I showed you before is that if we look at the income, the GDP per capita, we could see there are tremendous inequality between countries. And we can see there is also inequality in growth itself between countries. The consequence is that it has a huge impact on poverty reduction. So in order to reduce poverty, we need to increase mean income. At the same time, we need a redistribution of income through subsidies, through scholarships, but also a redistribution of assets, which is very important. So one way, of course, people always talk about the land reform, which is the best way to redistribute assets, especially for the poor. So remember that a growth and a change in inequality are key drivers of poverty reduction. And moving after COVID, we know that there is an increase in inequality because of differences in access to internet, differences in infrastructure that could also exacerbate poverty. We could also see that countries cannot grow at the same path. Therefore, our challenge moving forward is to rethink about new way of reducing poverty and promoting jobs, because one way COVID has affected poverty was through jobs. And doing that, you will be able to promote poverty and development in two ways. One way could be to shift the income distribution forward, meaning that people can reduce poverty by having much more income. So the income growth is one of the factors that could boost economic development and reduce poverty. The other way is through redistribution. And the impact of redistribution could also help reduce poverty. So now we have seen that many countries during COVID, many government designed redistribution policy. So for example, in Japan, students, especially foreign students, receive about $300 US to help them cope with job losses during COVID. And family, they receive subsidies, I think 2 times, depending on the number of children you have. They receive subsidies so that they can also cope with those shocks during COVID. So we see that government has been developing many policy of redistribution of income during COVID. What remains to be done is to promote growth. Otherwise, the effect on distribution will be very small. So put together, what is needed is to promote distribution of income, but also promote growth in a global way. And this is one of the challenges that we're facing nowadays. So when economic growth, as you know, probably inequality would increase given the Kuznets inverted U-curve. And when income gets a higher level, then of course, inequalities can start decreasing. But during COVID, we noticed that despite of high income, inequality start increasing. So one of the ways is to see people working in art, for example, because or musician. During COVID, there was no concerts, and most of them basically they lost their job. So that is, of course, one of the big fraction of the population who basically, first job losses. In the case of agriculture, many farmers also could not have access to intermediate input and their intrants. So therefore, they could not produce even if the demand was there. Therefore, there are many ways government can help us basically reduce poverty, but also promote a redistribution of resources. And that's where comes governments and institutions, because one of the key ways to accelerate the effect of growth and inequality in poverty reduction is having a good governance. So governance here is basically promoting redistribution institutions that could help us to promote growth that benefits the poor. So moving forward after COVID, I think poverty reduction should remain at the center of economic development, where we design policy that target the poor because they are the most who have unstable income and were affected by COVID. So that is very important. And if you look at research, there is a tremendous body of evidence going from Ravelion in 2005 that really put forward the fact that inequality is bad for the poor. So reducing inequality and disparity should be the key factor for economic growth and economic development policy after COVID, because we see that COVID could affect the factor of production of the poor, therefore increasing high inequality. And it's also important to remember that with imperfect markets, inequality in power and wealth will translate in unequal opportunity, leading to wasted productive potential and also to inefficient allocation of resources. And what we know is that during COVID, market became imperfect because of the lockdown. So the lockdown basically reduced the mobility of market where supply cannot meet demand. And therefore, household or people who have wealth and power could basically enjoy even the lockdown, while the poor could also go deep down into poverty. So this is basically telling us that we should really think about which factor could help us to shape economic development and political institutions in order to accelerate the reduction of poverty, but also promoting good markets. Okay, so with this theoretical background, because as I discussed before, we as economists, we need to know about theory, we need to look about the data so that we know how we can use those two backgrounds to design and inform development policy. In the third part of my presentation, I will go to the data, and together with you, we're gonna see what happened to economic development in a broader term during COVID, and of course, after COVID. So what is very important here is that if, before COVID, and the trend in economic, in world output was not that much satisfactory, especially after the financial crisis. We know that growth was slowing down. And also in the 2012 and 2013, global production was also slowing down. But what is important here is that the trend that we observed between 2016 and 2019 was disrupted during COVID. And there are many reports which basically point to the fact that there could be, there were probably a 3.5% fall in global outputs in 2020, but after that, the output growth will grow by 3% again, which is higher. But as you can see, even if the global outputs grow by 5%, it's gonna take some time for us to recover to the pre-COVID-19 trend. So which means that we are still lagging beyond the trend, and it will take us many efforts to reach pre-COVID-19 trend moving forward. And I think this is where rethinking economic development policy become a key issue, because we have a lot of work to do. And how can we accelerate the recovery is one key questions. Of course, if you think about the impact by country, we could see that countries are recovering, but in a very, very different ways. So if you see countries like China, the real growth has recovered very fast. And you know probably the reason, one of them being that China, after discovering the COVID-19, they designed policy of lockdown, of contact tracing, and that's really helped them to control the propagation of COVID moving forward, while other countries did not have those kind of systematic tracing policy. So China returned back very quickly. And of course, Indonesia also, we could see a 1.4% in the growth of income, which is very important and high if you compare to Russia or to Brazil, even to Australia. And it's just behind the world average. So which means that on average, Indonesia did pretty much good compared to other countries. While if you think about Spain, Argentina, Italy, or even the United Kingdom, you will see that most of those countries are really contracting. The economic output is contracting after COVID. So which means that there are countries which are taking advantage of the situation moving forward, while there are other countries which are really slowing down. And we could see that there are many variations. And many of countries slowing down are in Europe, but of course, one of them is Japan. And as you know, Japan was really struggling to sustain a high economic development, economic growth over time. And that was very much hit with COVID, especially because of its dependence of trade and import from other countries. And if you think about to what extent COVID did affect our economy, one way is to compare COVID with the global financial crisis of 2009 and 2010. And what we can see here, even in terms of number or in terms of share, we could see that the impact of COVID in terms of magnitude is much larger than the global financial crisis. And one of the reasons is that COVID limited not only the movement of labor, but reduces global supply chain. And we could see that the global supply chain were very fragile. So when countries start locking down, there were no movements of intermediate input. And because many countries are relying on global value chain, the global production basically slowed down. That has really affected economies. And we could see, if you compare around the world, the impact of COVID was much, much larger than that of the global financial crisis. Of course, the effect can be a little bit heterogeneous among countries, but at least we could see they're really large. And in terms of GDP, the result is also very similar. So, which is really telling us that this is probably a good way to rethink about economic policy. And what happened is that if you go back in mid-2021, during the post-lockdown period, you will see that post-lockdown growth acceleration were very much concentrated mostly in the United States, because they have a close regional trade linkages which reinforce each other, and also because the government of the United States designed a strong fiscal stimulus and of course monetary policy that was very prominent. And we could also see that in some East Asian countries where investment in infrastructure was helping countries to renew with economic growth. And we could see, for example, China, usually during lockdown, they invested a lot in infrastructure in order to promote and to increase the demand of many products and sustain economic growth. So, for example, this is the case of the United States, where we could see even during COVID, the demand for durable goods increased very fast. And one of the reasons was that many countries invested in infrastructure, which demanded a lot of durable goods. But at the same time, households also, they wanted to buy new washing machine, and because they had time to stay at home and then invest in household equipment. While if you see, for example, the demand of services, of course, increased, but with a very low pace. So one of them is, of course, tourism, which was very much affected, but there is a small rebound, which is not that much significant. But we can see that the demand of durable goods increased in both China, even in Japan, and also in the United States. But we could see a very shock in employment. So if you look at the employment population ratio in the United States, you could see that COVID has basically cut off employment at a rate that it is unimaginable here. And of course, the recovery has been a little bit faster than we thought, but we could see abrupt interruption of employment during COVID. So which means that there were some sectors we could benefit, especially from the government interventions than other sectors. And moving forward, we could also see tremendous shock, especially in terms of trade. So what were very interesting is that the measures such as lockdown, quarantine, and travel restrictions had a dramatic effect on trade. And we can see that the international flow of goods and services, it dropped, but depending again on countries, but at least the timing was very different. For example, trade from China dropped very early, while for other countries, it took a little bit sometimes to start dropping. But again, China recovered very fast if you compare, for example, to Africa and other countries in the regions. So in terms of imports, we could also see some changes, but at least Africa was not that much affected, depending, because of course the reliance on import is very much, and because import is basically for final consumption, while countries like Japan or even China, much of the import is on intermediate product. So therefore, with the slowdown in the supply chain, the effect on import was very large. But at least we could see that trade was very much affected in all of the countries. And one way which was very interesting is that if you look at the different pattern among transportation, you could see mixed pattern. So for example, if you see seaborne transportation had experienced a mixed pattern, and we could see a small drop in the containers because that was basically shipping with movement of people, while bulk and oil and chemicals trade increased very, very fast. And of course, for food, we could also see tremendous changes, but at least petroleum and natural gases actually stand during COVID. But we could see that other sectors were very much affected during COVID. And this is interesting to show us how the different demand, of course, of different products will affect trade moving forward. And of course, what is important, especially if you think about household, is the effect on commodity prices. And what we could see here is that even the commodity price have continued the upward trajectory, and most of them are increasing very fast. So we could see there is inflation everywhere, which has been accelerated because of the war in Ukraine. But what we could understand here is that the principal factors on the demand side exerting upward pressure on industrial commodity price in 2001 include, of course, the ongoing rebound in industrial production in China, where China basically decided to enhance production, and also the strong recovery observed in the United States, given the government fiscal policy and also monetary policy. And of course, this development really helped countries to recover very fast and affects the production of the economy. So with this said, we know that COVID affected economic development through many channels. Of course, the first one, as I mentioned, is through production, which is a common measure, an output through which COVID affected economic development. We also know that COVID affected economic development through the different demand pattern. So for example, we saw a positive effect on durable goods because of the government response, while employment had tremendous negative shocks. We also learned that lockdown, quarantine, and travel restrictions had tremendous effect on trade. And we could see from the data that the effect depends, of course, on countries because the timing of the lockdown were very different. Finally, we could understand that we had tremendous effect on prices because the demand exerted pressure on commodity prices, especially because the government of China, the United States, they had tremendous investment plan, which increased the demand, especially for minerals, while agricultural product and fuel commodity did not see a tremendous increase. Now, what I want to discuss next, maybe before I go to my last part, probably can I stop and raise some questions?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Okay, then let me go directly to the last part of the presentation.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so let me summarize. In the first part, I introduce the discussion with a sort of overview and historical trend of economic development paradigm and how we thought about economic development. So that was the first stage. Then I took you through some data to see first the role of economic development. Why do we need economic growth and the redistribution, which will definitely affect poverty? And then third, I take you through some data to see how COVID and what channels through which COVID affected economic development. In the last part of the discussion, I want to focus on SMEs, because what we knew during COVID is that small and medium enterprises are the backbone of economies, and they're the sector that creates jobs, that gives employment to the population. And that's the sector that feeds us. So what I want to discuss here are some specific policy and specific facts that we could take away to help us rethink about industrial economic development policy post-COVID. So what is important here is that there is a mixture of impact of COVID on SMEs. But at least we know that SME has been at the center of COVID-19 for the reason that SME represent close to 75% of all jobs in most affected sector, compared to 60% in the total business economy. So basically, SME employ most of the population. Therefore, they were the sector which was much more affected. And across the world, 40+ business surveys show that over 50% of SME experienced a strong drop in revenue and were at risk of being put out of business in less than 3 months. And we saw many firms really closed, even in our city here, many business closed because of the drop in the revenue. And of course, insolvency expected to rise significantly by 16% in 2020, 17% in 2020, and 60% in 2021. So many firms, they could not, sell because they don't have access to market. So therefore, one way could be to cut jobs, because cutting jobs is one way for them to reduce their costs. And importantly, we could see, if you follow some estimate over time, especially in OECD countries, where we have kind of good data, we can understand that some sectors were hit particularly very hard, including tourism, where SME dominates. Even in Japan, if you visit cities like Kyoto, for example, you will see there are a bunch of SMEs there, and many of them could be affected because there was no visitors from in Japan or abroad to visit them. So tourism was one of the key sectors. And if you think about OECD countries, because we have good data there, tourism accounts for about 4.4% of GDP and employs 6.9% of the population, but has 21.5% of service export, which is high. But, during COVID, we could see that the drop of tourism, especially international tourism, was very high, especially until December 2020. So therefore, we can basically do some back of the envelope analysis to understand that the COVID itself, especially when we think about SME, one of the way was that they did not have enough access to market, therefore reducing the production and employment. And also the number of startups, because startups actually are a good indicator of economic growth. So if you have many startups, it means business is good and people are having money. And the number of business creation, especially in France, were also going down, especially at the heat of COVID, showing us, to what extent new jobs could be affected over time. And we could see the same thing in the United States, especially if we compare 2000 with 1999. So 2019, we could see big differences between them. Therefore, it's very important for us to see that the COVID has really tremendous effect on jobs and also on new business. And in most of the countries, policy were sequenced to address this. And I learned many things. Basically, is that the health measure and information were very important. But on top of that, many SME had a chance to defer their payments, and actually the bank were very nice. So especially in Japan, banks could really talk to business and understand the requirements and try to help them because they knew that this situation can be temporary, but helping firms to keep their activities could be one of the good way to save them. And I think this was very important. So do some diagnostic and help them to do some deferral of their payments. And of course, from the policy perspective, this is where I really want to strengthen my discussion, is that, countries have enhanced SMEs access to credit. So many SMEs could access easily to credits to help them at least support some of their basic costs during COVID. And I think this was very important to help them survive. And of course, there was in many cases firms receiving wage subsidies, which was very popular in Japan. And what was very nice, that even bank could accept to provide wage subsidies to companies. And what was happening here is that local banks, so you have like national banks, which are very popular, but during COVID, we saw local banks becoming very close, working in proximity with business. So basically, if you live, let's say in Gajah, actually, I visited Gajah before. So let's say there is a Bank of Gajah. So the Bank of Gajah will basically help firms within the regions to with wage subsidies, for example, and also other grants. And that was something very popular in Japan. But of course, many of the countries put in place also some structural policy. So for example, acceleration of digitalization. So many companies here, especially the old small shops, which could not have online operations like ordering online or delivering services, the government decided to help them to digitalize their services, like updating their websites to include online shopping and link them to the delivery services. I think Panda became very popular in Japan because of the delivery, and using applications, because now many companies have like their own website, where you can order even using an app. And of course, that was a big help. And I've seen even some local government in Japan giving some school modem because they did not have access to internet, so they could deliver them some modem in order to increase internet access of these firms. So there were many policies that were put in place to help firms, enter the world of digitalization, and that really helped them to survive during COVID, but also to change the lifestyle and promote business dynamism. So that has really helped countries to increase their competitiveness and also resilience over long term. And even now, people are going back to restaurants, but food delivery has become one of the key mode of consumption here, even in Japan. So you can see people ordering food every night, or they don't want to go to eat outside just because they prefer ordering, because it became one of the most convenient way to eat outside. So we could see that there was many loan guarantees, new scheme that were designed like boost in funding in Austria and UK, and easier access to finance, like in France, which basically help SME to have better access to finance. But of course, there were also many direct loans in many countries, like I mentioned about Japan, with really high funding to SMEs, and of course, equity and grants. And I think grant was really a key driver to support SME and wage subsidies here. So we've seen many loss in jobs in Japan because the wage subsidy policy were very, very efficient. And probably a final takeaway here is that if you think about how do we rethink economic development policy here, so focusing on SME is, I think, to me, one of the key way to move forward for the reasons I mentioned before. So we can think about the access. So how do we ensure a fast track access to support SMEs and self-employment? And of course, while ensuring accountability. And probably we can think about some instruments we can develop to do so. Because we believe that SME access are key for employment and poverty reduction. Therefore, having access to finance can help them, to survive, especially during economic shock like COVID. And of course, thinking about the sustainability, about alternative financing mechanism and other channels to avoid over-indebtedness of SME. And of course, especially how can equity and growth capital can be mobilized to help them, face those challenges. And of course, business dynamism. How do we support innovative entrepreneurship? We've seen a lot of service delivery business which have been growing, but we could see the development of new apps that are doing new way of business. So how do we develop frameworks, especially regulatory frameworks, to enable startup growth is one of the new policy we could think. And moving forward, especially in the long term, how do we move from crisis management to structural policy in order to help to enhance SME resilience, but also improve competitiveness in the long term. So we're thinking about digitalization, but also reskilling and new markets and new global value chain. So this is, I think, in a summary, some of the key way of designing new policy I'm putting on the table so that it can help us to see ways we can move forward post-COVID. Okay, so this is gonna be the end of my presentation, and I want to spend the rest of the time for discussion or Q&A. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ocia. I think this is very, very extended explanation about the rethinking development policy lesson from the COVID-19. I welcome you, all of the participants, to have the questions. But I don't see it is the case because maybe your explanation is very extended and very good. Yes, I think I have one. Okay, this is from Mr. Gugus Febri Putranto. 98% of businesses in Indonesia are micro, small, and medium enterprises. Then, in fact, from the data from the Indonesian National Socioeconomic Survey, SUSENAS, in 2021, only about 23% of households access credit for their business, and many businesses have not used digital technology in their business. Then what is the right and main policy for Indonesia in terms of encouraging SMEs to develop in the post-COVID-19 period, especially to be able to enter the global value chain to increase exports and increase economic growth? Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question, I think, because, yeah, maybe if I can add that in the SUSENAS survey, it is stated that Indonesian on average still take like 9 years of education. So it's like a junior high school on average. So maybe, yeah, in terms of technology, maybe not all of the SMEs can have it, Professor.
Exactly. This is a very interesting question. I'm very surprised about the numbers. It's 98% of business which are small and medium and micro is huge. And I think, one way is to have access, to increase access to credit. So, of course, one way usually is to regroup firms, because I know many, if you ask younger people, what do you want to do in the future? They say, I want to become my own boss. So we have many small micro enterprise. So regrouping them together to create some clusters, not to unify them as company, but to create clusters, can really help them to have a sort of a comparative advantage in accessing many resources, like, of course, finance. So I think that could be very good. The other policy is to create linkages with international companies, because what I know is that Indonesia has a lot of resources, and there are many foreign companies which are producing Indonesia for export, but also for the domestic market. And how do you link, SMEs with, international company will really help you leverage, many advantages, like access to finance, but also access to technology. Because most of those international firms, they have technology, they have new management method. So linking up with them could really help SME to solve the finance problem. That happened actually in Vietnam, where you had, they call it industrial supporting policy, where for each international company clusters, you have domestic company providing them intermediate input and providing them assistance. And therefore, in the long term, they learn how those international companies' requirements are, and they learn from the management practices, and over time they grow and they get bigger. And of course, they solve the problem of finance. The other is entrepreneurship education, because what we know is that many farmers are many firm owners. Some of them, they have low education, but some of them, they don't know, also they did not study entrepreneurship. And I'm very happy, because in many universities, entrepreneurship and business creations are becoming a normal field that students can follow, and also outsider can come back and learn. But I think it's really important to promote entrepreneurship by giving people, education. So, for example, I know many SME, especially micro firms, do not know how to basically, produce their accounting stuff. They don't know even how to apply credit for credit. They don't have a sort of a standardized accounting system where they can report their profits. They take their business as if it's a family matter, while they should have a separation between business and family. So these are very small factors that we can, enable in order to help firms have access to credit and grow. So moving post-COVID, I think this is the second part of the question, because it's really encouraging to see that there are many SMEs, but how do you help them to enter into value chain to increase exports, but also increase economic growth? One way is to first to focus on domestic market, because I think Indonesia has a tremendous population. There is a tremendous market. So helping firms to understand the needs of the local population is very important. So, teaching them how to be innovative could be one of the way. But I believe that by helping them to solve domestic problems, that could really help them to increase economic growth and probably create competitive advantage to basically enter into global value chain. And COVID has given us many opportunities. So if you think about the development of applications in Japan here, if you are very busy with work, there are many applications that will help you. For example, if you have kids, you can register for babysitting in the neighborhood. And if there is one family who is free, you can take your kids there. They can babysit, and in return, you can either pay or you can even babysit some of the other kids. So basically, there are new applications that have been developed during COVID to help people solve problems. So helping SMEs to become innovative and to solve problems that society is facing could be one way to promote economic development among SMEs. So these are probably general answers I could give in order to solve the problem of having low productive SMEs because of access to finance. Thank you very much for the very nice question.
Thank you very much for the answers, Professor Ochia. Is there any feedback from Mr. Gugus? I don't think this is the case. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. Is there still another questions? Before I deliver my own questions, actually, because it is very interesting for me. I think some of you raise hand. Yes. Please, on mic.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity, Mrs. Farah. So I'm interested about the Professor Christian Ochia explanations about the some of the challenges for economic development. I want to say in national context, Indonesia is an archipelago country, right? Has a lot of island that I say hardly connected with other regions that could be connected in via water transportations or maybe via air transportations, via plane. And these things just came in my mind. The internet right now is largely used, especially after the COVID, right? Not just students do their study via internet and the workers do their job via internet, but also the consumptions activities of the people using the internet, right? Using the e-commerce website or maybe applications. And this is, I think, accommodate, I say, like interregional transfer. Like the capital can easily outflow from one region to another and will settle in certain regions. What do you think about this technological development, especially internet development? Is it a challenge for economics development, especially on reducing disparities? And if this is a problem, what government should do? So that's my question.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting question. And actually, if you think about, let me move from the case of Japan, which is also an island with not many island as Indonesia. But I think, land transportation is very developed, but what really helped people during COVID was internet, because students could stay home and basically have access to classes, but also worker could work easily from home, even if there are other factors that could reduce their productivity, but at least access to internet was one of the key driver of fast recovery in Japan. And as you clearly mentioned, in the case of Indonesia, while water and air transportation can be alternatives, especially for moving goods, I believe internet should be spread everywhere, because that's the easiest way to reduce economic disparity and promote income growth in the globalized area. There are two reasons for that. So first, internet can help us to learn and acquire new capabilities. And I've seen, for example, YouTube has become one driver of economic development, because you can self-teach yourself using YouTube. And of course, you can access to Google, you can download books. I've seen some of my students coding with R, Python, because they can just Google, everything on internet and learn to do by themselves. So internet is one way to break those learning barrier and improve human capital accumulation and productivity very fast. Second, internet can be a way for SME to access to markets. And because there is no frontier with internet, then you can basically sell your product. You can, access to foreign market in a very easy way and in a very fast way. So having access, and usually there is no barrier cost for people to use internet, because if you can at least read, you are able to use internet and, take advantage of it. So I think internet should be a basic, good that should be promoted in all over the countries, especially because Indonesia has many islands. But at the same time, of course, infrastructure development is also needed. For one reason is that infrastructure development create demand and also create jobs. And because Indonesia has also many natural resources, promoting infrastructure development could basically increase the demand for natural resources, also promote local economic development. So this could be go hand to hand, because you can also build infrastructure to develop, internet and to increase the speed of internet. So I believe that internet should be promoted very fast. And that can also link to, as you mentioned, the flow of capital, because I know there are many joint venture that has been, becoming very popular because people met on the internet and they start working together. So there are many advantages of internet, especially from the business perspective post-COVID. So I totally agree with your statements, and I believe that policymaker could enable internet access, especially for micro firms who need to access to global markets and become much more productive. So thank you very much for your comments, which I believe are very, very interesting.
Yes, okay, thank you, Mr. Dimas. And let's move on to Mr. Muhammad Faisal Fadli again.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Farah, for the opportunity. And also, I want to ask question to Mr. Christian Ochia about. Before that, I want to give some appreciation to Mr. Christian Ochia for the wonderful presentation. There's a lot of insightful knowledge that we could learn as a undergraduate student. For me, the question is the concept of besides the SMEs, there are also concept in Indonesia called koperasi or cooperative union, which also help the people's economy to increase in recent years. But after the post-COVID period, can this concept revive the economic development, especially in developed countries and developing countries? Thank you very much.
Yes, it's of course very interesting question. One of the way to look at cooperative union, maybe in the case of Japan, is that usually farmers have a lot of cooperative, and they need to access to markets. So what they usually do is along the highway, the cooperative usually they build kind of a market along the highway when car can stop there, and they expose all of the produce of the local farmers. So if you're moving, from let's say Tokyo to Nagoya to Osaka, along the way, you're gonna stop maybe 5 times, and you can buy local produce. And those shops, those markets are developed by cooperative union. And, farmer can expose their goods there and have big access to market, but also it's helped them to have access to finance. That's why I mentioned that firm could create clusters to be together, because they can, easy, barrier of having access to finance. So I think cooperacy is a good way to promote economic development, especially local economic development, by helping farmers not only to access to market, but also to transform the product. And that is one of the cases I've seen a lot. Even I remember I did some field work in Kacamada a long time ago, probably now it's 10 years ago. And we visited the batik industry, because many women were working in the batik industry, and they make batik manually. And after you do that, you have to sell them. And one way was to export them to the Netherlands or to Australia. And they were doing that through cooperative, because a farmer cannot export by himself. So therefore, cooperative usually help them to export those handmade batik to export markets. So I really believe that having the cooperative is one way, of course, to educate also farmers. There could be a new technology, and that can go through cooperative. And the other way is through prices, because sometimes farmer cannot negotiate price because they have low capacity. Going through cooperative can help them to increase their bargaining power and therefore be able to sell their produce at very high price. So I really believe that we could look at the cooperative very, very closely. It's a very good topic because I have a background in agriculture, in agricultural economics. So I'm very interested to learn more about the cooperacy in the case of Indonesia. But I think that can also move not only for farmers, but also for different kind of SME working even in the service sector. So helping firms to group themselves together into clusters, because when they are in a cluster, even if they are located in the same place, developing a cluster or a cooperative could help them to increase their bargaining power. And they can negotiate, for example, the access to internet, they can negotiate to have a bigger bandwidth, or they can negotiate many things because they increase their bargaining power. So again, I'm very happy that you mentioned these concepts, which is very new to me. But when I compare it with the cooperative union in Japan and in other countries, I can really tell that they're very important to promote local development. And moving forward after COVID, I think resources should be invested also in those cooperatives because they are close to farmer and they can help farmer reorganize. Because what we knew from COVID is that COVID was a kind of a global shock, but the response to COVID are very local and they are very localized. So therefore, local institutions should be strengthened in order to give responses to local problems. So, and I think cooperacy is one of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christian Ochia, for the answer. And also, you've mentioned cooperative could build around people who doesn't know how to use technology, so they could produce more, what is it called, materials like staple materials, and they also access a lot of things in the internet because of the knowledge of technology. Thank you very much, Mr. Christian.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for both of you, actually. What about the other participants? Is there any questions to deliver today in our discussion? Probably it's not the case, but I think if you don't mind, I have a question, I think, about COVID-19. COVID-19, as we all know, that first and foremost a public health crisis, but eventually all of us hit by this crisis, especially for economic condition and also other aspects from social and also demography also. And we see that right now the global pandemic is kind of over in some area. Especially in Indonesia, we don't have any case that is spike, but maybe in Australia still emerge. If I'm not mistaken, in Western Australia, it is 17,000 cases per day, new cases per day for COVID-19. But what is your opinion, Professor Ochia, about this event, or is that the global recovery likely to be sustained?
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting point you mentioned. Yes, COVID is a public health crisis with consequences everywhere. Mm-hmm. And what we have learned, in the beginning of of COVID, we used to know COVID by numbers. And, it was very interesting to see that everybody became to like statistics. So we could see data around the world and compare figures and say, wow, COVID is there, until you lock down and you see some of your neighborhood being affected. But what has been very important here is to understand that the development of vaccine, for example, has been very fast. Of course, we have seen a lot of inequality in access in the distribution of those vaccines, but somehow we've known that they have helped a lot to control the pandemic. And even if we have new variant of COVID, probably we will not go back to the initial stage of those very high numbers. So that is one. And second, we have learned how to use local knowledge, because I've seen many countries which, of course, did not have access to even the PCR test itself, but they have used local knowledge to basically become more resilient and to struggle against COVID. So I think we have gone a long way from 2020 to now. And as you mentioned, Indonesia, probably nobody's like talking about COVID or being scared. I've seen it also in the Philippines, everything is normal now. In Japan, of course, we are still doing online classes combined with face-to-face classes. But yes, moving forward, I think people understand that COVID can become temporary, and then people have to go back to reinvest in the recovery, but also to develop new way of reacting to those global pandemic, because it's true that we're gonna have another pandemic, not tomorrow, but sometimes in the future. But how do we learn and how do we become more resilient in the future? These are open questions that we have to start thinking from now, especially how do we protect the weak? And this is something that we have learned during vaccination. Probably we start with elderly people, with people who are more exposed to COVID, but I think that should be embedded in our lifestyle so that we know that when there is any pandemic, that we should really help, protect the weaker. And if we design any policy, we should be targeting. And that's one of the lessons I've learned during COVID, is that economic policy is always about targeting, because we really have to target specific people so that by helping the situation, they can create spillover to the other population. So one way is, of course, as I argue, to focus on SME, because when we help SME, they can spread the spillover in the local economy. The other way could be to enhance education, especially vocational training. We did not talk about that, but I believe vocational training should be very important to link research from university to the actual practice in factories. And how do you link domestic university with domestic training center? These are discussions that we should be putting on the table moving forward. But again, I think I agree with you that we've gone a long way from COVID. And now we have to start thinking about how do we build our resilience and become less vulnerable to pandemic moving forward.
Thank you very much. I think, it is our big homework together to face the new normal, actually. Okay, is there still any questions? I think Faisal Fadli, are you going to deliver questions again?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry if
Next
there
question.
is any there's many questions that I want to ask
It's okay.
to Mr. Christian Ochia, because I think I want to ask you about the COVID effect that Japan has over the past few years, I guess in 2020. Japan, I think, has a lot of income in their tourist attraction. For example, like Akihabara, which is one of my favorite places that I want to visit, and also many places in Japan that I want to visit. And since COVID, like people cannot go to Japan, and unfortunately, I think people who wants to go to Japan has been restricted in their countries because of COVID. Does Japan economic affected by these situations, like the tourist attraction becoming more and more not what is it called? Wait.
Thank you very much.
Crowded, I think. Yeah. Like tourist attraction are not crowded, and all that kind of stuff. What do you think, Mr. Christian Ochia, about that situation? Thank you very much.
That's a very nice question. I like Akihabara as well. it's a very crowded place, and it's a very nice place. So I think if you look from the standpoint of tourism, of course, that is one of the key driver of Japanese economy. And Japan has done serious, prevention policy. But what is first important to remember is that compared to South Korea, for example, Japan was not much prepared, to counter COVID because of many domestic reasons. Uh, so at the beginning of COVID, there were not many PCR tests in Japan available. So basically, people were, asked to lock down, to stay at home. But if one of your neighbor is basically a positive case, then they ask you to go to do a PCR test. But it was not like, enrolling everyone to the test because of several technical reasons. But what was very important here is that because Japanese people, they love wearing masks. Usually people have masks here. And Japanese people are usually obedient because they really understand that, taking care of themselves is much more important, but not hurting other people or not contaminating other people is much, much more important. So people wear masks not because they don't want to be contaminated, but because they don't want to spread the virus. So that is how Japanese people think. So therefore, if you think about international tourism, it was very much affected in Japan because Japan closed the borders and they prevented people to come into Japan. But at the same time, Japan had many local policy to promote tourism within Japan. So one of them is, they call it a go to eat campaign and go to travel campaign. So basically, if you want to travel in another region, the government basically would cover some of your expenses. So for example, you want to take a train and visit like another city, like you go to Surabaya, for example. Then when you go to Surabaya, your hotel, basically 70% you pay and 30% the government cover that. If you go to eat in the restaurants, of course, you're going to pay everything, but you're going to get some point back and you can use them in another restaurant. So there were those campaigns that increased mobility during COVID. And of course, there were some period which it was completely locked down, but other period, there were many campaigns helping people to move around. So the impact, of course, on economic growth was negative because the income growth in Japan really contracted by almost 4%. But the government at least intervened in several ways to mitigate the negative effects. And there were many policies depending on the number of positive cases. So sometimes, for example, the Go to Eat campaign was restricted in one region, in one prefecture. So for example, they can say, if you are in Tokyo, you can go to restaurant within Tokyo and then use the Go to campaign subsidies, but you cannot go to another prefecture because they basically prohibited inter-prefectural movement, but you can move within your prefecture. So there were many policies put in place over time to sort of control the spread of of COVID, but at the same time promoting tourism within Japan. So to that extent, I think Japan did well. And of course, the other way is Japanese people usually they follow the rules because naturally they don't want to spread the virus. And that was one of the key factors. Of course, there are many companies which closed a lot, because many of them are very old and they needed much more support to the government, but they could not get those. So I think many of them closed. So the impact is, of course, negative because COVID was a global shock, but at least the government tries best to develop many domestic policy. So put together, as of, I think, this week, the government decided to open the borders, especially to encourage group tourism. So now, I think from maybe this week, next week, group could come, as many as possible, I guess. And of course, they can access to many sites and so on. That will probably help countries rebuild. But they have actually developed many control policy at the borders in order to limit the spread of the virus. But at least they're trying their best. to design specific policy. And of course, these are changing a lot over time. But yeah, I think the overall impact is negative, as you mentioned. So hopefully we can see you in Akihabara some days in the future.
Yeah, hopefully if I have money to go there. So thank you very much, Mr. Christian Ochia, for answering my questions.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Actually, I should close the discussion today because of the time. I would like to say many things, but I think, is there any questions? Oh no, okay. Yeah, I think I would like to say many thanks for you, especially Professor Ochia, and hopefully we will meet again in the next opportunity for a better occasion, and hopefully in what the location is is that
Akihabara?
Yeah, there. Okay. I could not really conclude from our discussion because it is too broad, but I think one thing that I should highlight from Professor Ochia's presentation is that we have to rethink again. We have to rethink, and we have to think about our lesson that learned from COVID-19 that emerged, and then we reshape again or reformulate again the policy and also the policy about the development of the economics. I mean, I will state again, we have to rethink from the eyeglass of COVID-19 to better policy reformulation to have our development of economics to be better. I think that's all for me. Hopefully we will meet again in other occasion in Indonesia and also in Japan. I will give, yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. It is a lot of work from you, and then also in the PowerPoint, it is very rich of data. So I think it is very interesting to go deep down again. And I will give back again to Stephanie as the MC.
Okay, thank you so much to Mrs. Farah for leading the discussion. And thank you to the enthusiastic participants for the question. And last but not least, thank you to Professor Christian Ochia for the insightful knowledge. Hopefully what has been conveyed can provide benefits for all of us. And we have now come to the end of the agenda. I would like to thank you for spending your time with us on this bright afternoon. And hopefully what has been conveyed again can provide benefits for all of us. I'm Stephanie Sitorus. Goodbye and have a nice day. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.